Hi, my name is Kaitlyn Dozler. I am a graduate student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln School of Natural Resources, and today I'm going to be talking to you about my grad student research involving the influence of virtual fence on the heart rate response in beef cattle. So to get things started off, we are first going to talk about virtual fencing past present. So I always like to start off with these images and just kind of give you a little background on what virtual fencing is. Virtual fencing is an invisible barrier created using a GPS positioning system designed to keep cattle in or out of an area by administering audio and mild electrical cues. So basically, it is an invisible fence that ranchers implement. The system we use is all done via satellites, and cows then get these virtual fencing collars that they wear. And then if the cow gets too close to that invisible boundary, they first hear a sound go off to try and get them to turn around. And if the cow continues to try and go forward, then that's when they get that mild shock. So I like to call the picture from our early 2000s almost like our robot cow. It's a really big system. Obviously, it's not very robust for a cow to be out on the landscape with a system that big. It was one of the very first virtual fence prototypes. And then we move forward to today's virtual fencing collar in 2023. So you can see the computer system is located in the bottom gray part of the collar. The chain goes all the way up around the neck, and then it is secured. This is at that time we were using zip ties. It's now further to carabiners. So just to touch on a few differences between our physical fences and our virtual fences. So a lot of times with conventional fence, you see that horseshoe and barbed wire, tough as nails. 9 times out of 10, those cattle aren't going to get through it. But for situations like rotational grazing, if you want to implement that into your operation, then you start to see a little bit of problems. So that's where maybe you'd start to implement that electric fence. You know, it's more flexible than barbed wire, less expensive, but it's more time consuming to put up, manage, go out and check every single day, stuff like that. And then that's when we move into the virtual fence side of things. So sky's the limit on flexibility. There's no physical fence to go out and have to check and mess with. Of course, you know, cell service and sometimes like that can be an issue, and it might not always be 100% effective. You can always have those problem cows. But I think the real question is people are trying to look at, is it safe to be able to be using on the cows, and is it cost effective for ranchers? So the next thing I want to talk about is virtual fence and the stress it can potentially cause on the animal. So I really like this picture from Lee and Campbell 2021, where it talks about the different kinds of stress cattle endure. So cattle can endure acute stress, which is stress that typically inhibits behavioral responses. And it's stress that usually only lasts minutes to a couple of hours. It's very short. Oftentimes, it's a high stress, or it's not a high stress inducing situation, excuse me. It's associated with relatively short stress responses. Cattle exhibit the stress or a stress response like running away, and it's followed by a very quick recovery to a normal state. Heart rate is the key physiological measure of acute stress. So if you look at our Lee and Campbell photo, you can see that cows that experience chronic stress this often happens between months and years. And you can run and test for a lot of those using fecal samples, hair samples, things like that. But where virtual fencing falls is actually on the lines of, it takes cows anywhere from minutes to hours to learn like where those virtual fence boundaries are. And they might see a steep like shock event when they very first experience it, but oftentimes their heart rate's going to come back down to normal rates very quickly. And so it's not a high stress event on the cattle whatsoever. So a little bit of background on my study. We are looking at the influence of virtual fence keys on the heart rate response in cattle. So the purpose of our study was to evaluate acute stress response of cattle managed with virtual fence by measuring their heart rate and their movement. Our objectives were to examine heart rate and movement changes in individual cows during 30-minute control in virtual fence treatment periods at the beginning and ending of the grazing season. And our hypothesis was, like we talked about before, acute cattle stress measured by heart rate would be very short term with the virtual fence. We don't expect this to be a big stress event to cows. So the methods for our study. So we used 20 mature red Angus cows with calves fitted with the Vents virtual fence system. So that's under the company Merck. We had 10 cows also fitted with the polar heart rate system. And we had a 30-minute control. We had a 30-minute control and virtual fence trials before and after the 60-day grazing season with virtual fence. So a little bit of a summer timeline here. So our pre-grazing trial occurred on June 15th, and during this trial, we recorded the cow's heart rate and physical reaction to virtual fence before our 60-day summer grazing season. So cows went through our trials. They went through a period where they didn't have any virtual fence around them at all, and we got heart rates. And then they went through the virtual fence period, and we collected physical observations and heart rates. And then the cows were set out on that 60-day grazing season where they were trained, and we switched up the virtual fences on them about every 2 weeks to give them something new to experience and learn. And then we brought the cows back in on August 15th, and we did a post-graze trial, identically to the pre-graze trial, besides the fact that the cows' virtual fence collars stayed on the whole time. They weren't active, so there was no virtual fence active during that control period, but they were wearing them. And so the whole point of this and the goal of it was to compare those heart rates and those physical reactions from the pre-grazing trial to the post-grazing trial to see if we thought our cows learned the virtual fence boundaries and if their reactions were any different. So for our trials, we are here at the Goodmanson Sandhills Research Ranch. So for our control period, the cows were fitted with the heart rate monitors, and the pairs were moved into this 0.9 hectacre pen that you see here on the screen for 30 minutes to establish a baseline heart rate. So the virtual fence was not on during this control period. The cattle were then brought back in and fitted with the virtual fence collars you see down in the bottom corner of your screen. And they were randomly split into 5 observation groups with 4 cow-calf pairs in each group. Then the virtual fence was activated that you see on your screen with a 3-meter audio width and a 15-meter shock width. And each group was individually let out into the same pen with an active virtual fence for 30-minute observations, where technicians recorded cow behaviors and physical responses to the cows interacting with the virtual fence. So a little bit about the heart rate monitoring system that we used. We used a polar adaptive heart rate monitoring system. So we had custom polyester girth bands equipped with polar heart rate monitoring technology, and they recorded a constant heart rate reading on our cows every single second. So these bands were a little tricky. They were a little bit of a learning curve to try and figure out how to get them to stay secure and tight fitting on the cow. So that way we were getting accurate heart rate readings. So what we ended up doing is we were able to wrap the girth band behind the cow's front shoulders with one electrode placed behind the cow's front left leg and the other electrode placed midway up the cow's left shoulder. And it's just something to note, the polar heart rate monitor system did pass a precision, accuracy, and reliability test, stating that it is a proper system that can be used to actively monitor cattle heart rate. And the picture you see is the Polar Pacer H10 watch synced to the heart rate monitor. So we had to zip tie these watches to these polyester girth bands wrapped around the cattle because the heart rate monitor sent the data to the watch, which recorded everything. And so our cows were walking around with these big bands around them and these watches zip tied to the top of the bands. It was quite the show to see. So for the physical observations, it's just what you see here in the photos. We recorded the number of cues received and the physical responses and behaviors of the cows when interacting with the virtual fence. And that was recorded by our trained observers. So this is typically what you saw. You had cows out there with just the virtual fencing collars on. You had cows out there with the heart rate monitors and the virtual fencing collars. And we just recorded all of those different observations over 30 minutes. So this is a really good example of a cow from our study. So you can see the first heart rate electrode down behind that cow's left front leg. And then you can see the heart rate monitor midway up the cow and the polar watch zip tied on top. And then the virtual fencing collar. So to get these polyester girth bands to stay in place, we had to get pretty creative. So the first thing that we did is we took a clipper and we shaved the hair from where that heart rate electrode was going to sit so it could have a stronger connection. And then we ended up going and putting ultrasound gel on to increase that connection even more. And we used livestock sale tag glue, which is 100% safe to use on cattle. And we were able to go in and glue that band in place to stop whatever movement we could, and to try and get the most accurate heart rate readings all of the time. And then an observation ID number was placed on the back hip of the cow, just to make it easier for those trained observers in the pen. So this is an example during our summer grazing season of how the virtual fence would work. So all of the red dots are individual cow GPS locations, and the red box with the white outline in the bottom corner is a virtual fence exclusion zone. So we did not want the cows entering in this corner of the pasture. So as you'll see, as the video goes, it plays a little fast. You'll be able to see all of the cows' GPS locations over the course of time. And then you'll be able to see some of them did break through a couple of times, but for the most part, we saw success with our virtual fence out on the summer range. So I'll play it in. Yeah, so that's a really good indicator for us. And being it was towards the end of July, it was a really good indicator that by the end of that summer grazing season, that the cows were learning and respecting that virtual fence. So some of the statistics we used for our study, individual cow heart rates were measured in beats per minute, and cow movement data was measured in distance traveled per minute for the 30-minute control and virtual fence periods. Each cow group was treated as the experimental unit, and the cow groups were identical for both pre and post graze trial, so they didn't change up at all. A mixed model analysis of variance with time of the trial, so pre and post graze, and treatment, so controlled or virtual fence, were our fixed effects. And the cow group within the pre and post graze trial time was treated as our random variable to account for repeated measure. So my favorite parts, we get to get into our results. So our average heart rate did not differ between the control and virtual fence periods in both the pre and post grazing trials. Heart rate was 25% less in the post grazing trials compared to the pre grazing trials. And movement during the virtual fence period was 1.8 times greater during the pre graze and 7.7 times greater during the post graze trials than the control period. I think by looking at the figure on this slide, so if we start to look at the figure, we can see that our top bar graph is heart rates measured in that beats per minute, and our bottom is our movement. And so I think some really, really great things to point out. Like I said, we didn't see a difference in the average heart rate between the control and virtual fence periods in both the pre and post grazing trials. So that was great news on our end. So basically what's that starting to tell us is the cows aren't experiencing a really big spike in heart rate, which is letting us know that it's very likely that those stress levels are not increasing to a point where it could then be harmful for the cow. They're having those stress events, and then those heart rates are returning very quickly. And so that's showing us that virtual fence likely is not going to be a big stressor when it comes to cattle health. Another really, really interesting thing that I like to point out is if you look on the movement side, the cow showed 57% less movement, which was significant during the post-graze trial compared to the pre-graze trial. So we thought, because the cows showed that 57% less movement during the post-graze trial compared to the pre-graze trial, that's telling us that when they do go and interact with that virtual fence, or even during that control period, our reactions are becoming a lot smaller. We're not seeing a cow getting the slight shock from a virtual fence and then running across the pen because they don't know what's happening to them. They're recognizing those signals, and their reactions are becoming a lot smaller. They're a lot calmer. They're not walking around the pen all the time. They're not stressed trying to find a way out. They're there, and a lot of times they're potentially just grazing, kind of milling around with their calf. And a lot of our observations we saw by the end of that 30-minute period, a lot of the cows were laying down in the middle of the pen. They weren't stressed. They didn't exhibit behaviors that showed any sort of behavior along those lines, especially towards the end of that 30-minute period. Also, another exciting thing to note was heart rate was actually 25% less in the post-graze trial compared to that pre-graze trial. So that again is telling us that the cows had that opportunity to learn that virtual fencing system over the summer. Thus, by the time they experienced it again in August, they were like, okay, we know what we're doing. We know what to expect from this. And so that's why we think we saw those decreases in the heart rate. So on to the movement side of things, cattle movement, like I said before, tended to really decrease about 10 to 15 minutes into those virtual fencing periods. So this image displays that really well. If you look at our pre-grazing, which is on top, versus our post-grazing on the bottom. So our dots are the movements and heart rates during the the dots are the heart rates during the virtual fence period, and the X's are during the heart rates during the control period, and the bars on the bottom are the cow's movements. So what you can see a lot of times is during that first, again, 10 to 15 minutes, we see it happen where the cattle's heart rates are a lot higher, are a lot more separated, and their movements are a lot higher. And we expect that's because that's when those animals are first entering that pen. They're exploring their new environment. They're trying to go out to the gate that they came in the pen out of, or that they got into the yard. They're trying to get out of that gate. And then, so while they're experiencing these things for the first time and learning that virtual fence boundary, once they start to get a feel for the pen and understand where those boundaries are, then we start to see those heart rates come back together and that movement really start to drop off, which again is a good sign for us, showing that the cattle are learning the system and it's not causing them a high amount of stress whatsoever. Heart rate didn't differ over the whole 30-minute period. So the image is broken down from minute 0 to minute 30 for one of our cows throughout the whole virtual fence 30-minute observation period. And that's likely associated, like we said before, with more movement of the animals during the virtual fence trial. Heart rate was slightly higher. Again, it was them coming into the pen for the first time and things like that. This is probably my favorite graphic to share when talking about our results. So this is a cow's EKG that we took out and were able to break down over the course of her whole day. So this is really exciting because we can see those spikes in heart rates, which probably indicate the most stressful point in that cow's day. And it actually did not occur during the virtual fencing period. So you can see at the very beginning of our day where we see that first spike in heart rate. And that's when that first heart rate monitor was put on that animal, and that animal was exposed to that new technology for the first time. And so that just took some getting used to. And then we can move on to our control period, where again, we see some spikes in heart rates, some spikes in movement, which is the light gray bars on the bottom, and the heart rate is the black bars on the top, with the red dash being the mean heart rate in between. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. But we see a couple little spikes, but overall, heart rate seems relatively normal. Then we go to put those cows back in that chute to put that virtual fencing collar on, and that's when we see the highest spike in cattle heart rate that day. The cows did not enjoy getting run back through the chute and getting another piece of technology put on them. And so because of that high heart rate, we can say that was probably the most stressful point in that cow's day. But again, the heart rates went down relatively quickly once they got out of that chute and were able to adjust to the technology. And then we move on to the virtual fencing period there in the box in red. And honestly, a lot of our heart rates are pretty well even with our mean heart rates that we saw throughout the day. Again, there's those couple of spikes where those cows interacted with that virtual fence. But overall, there's not a big difference in the heart rate we saw in the control period versus the heart rate we saw during the virtual fence period. And when the cows were done with their virtual fencing period, they were moved into a large holding pen. And then later that night, they were moved out into a larger pasture just to graze. So you can see the difference between the cattle's heart rates in those couple of different events. And then moving on, we wanted to talk about the number of audio cues and the number of electrical cues. So while the number of audio cues didn't differ between the pre and post-graze trials, this wasn't really surprising to us because that is kind of that first barrier. So that's what goes off when those cows are trying to learn those boundaries and learn where they go and can't go. So it didn't surprise me that the number didn't really change. But what I was excited to see was the number of electrical cues was significantly fewer during the post-graze trial. So what that is showing us is the fact that those cows are learning that audio cue. When they hear that audio cue, they know to turn around and not continue forward, especially after going through that first trial and the 60 days on summer pasture. By the time they came in for that post-graze trial, they knew what they were doing. So just some physical observations to talk about here really quick. During the audio cues and electrical cues, that's kind of how we have this image split up. And then our pre-graze trials are in dark gray, while our post-graze trials are in white. And as you can see, the two biggest ones that I wanted to point out are the running and jumping. So while we saw a lot of running and jumping during the pre-graze trial, this was the cows hearing that shock and sound for the first time, getting used to that new equipment, stuff like that. We saw very big reactions out of the cows. Whereas during those post-graze trials, we didn't see any reaction like that whatsoever. The cows seemed relatively calm. They might have thrown their heads, something along those lines, but we didn't see those really big, like, stress reactions, which was really good to see, especially on the electrical cue side. And on the audio cue side, this is something we weren't quite, don't know if we were as excited to see, but it kind of comes with the times. So during the pre-graze trial, we saw a very limited reaction to the stimulus. A lot of the times, the cows reacted in either big or small ways. But then we got to that post-grazing trial, and we saw a lot more cows hear that audio cue and just not respond. They stood there and continued grazing. They knew they weren't going to get shocked. They knew what that sound meant, and they knew they were still fine standing there, even maybe they weren't supposed to. And then you also have some of those cows where you could hear the sound go off, and they just like look at you, and they just go exactly where they know they're not supposed to go. You know they're not supposed to go, and you watch them get shocked, and they just keep going. So, like we said, the system isn't 100% containment rate by any means. I mean, we still saw an 85 to 95% efficacy rate in keeping those cows enclosed, but there's always going to be those cows that like to try and get out. We did have some problems with the collars. One collar fell off, one collar broke. The difference in the number of electrical cues between our two trials suggests that training is very, very important when it comes to teaching your cows the system and how the system works and how to properly react to the system to avoid a lot of those electrical cues. And like I said before, we had 85 to 95% efficacy containment during our 60-day summer trial. So finally, in conclusion, acute cow stress with virtual fence appears to be short term, and normal heart rates return very quickly. Movement increases after the initial contact with the virtual fence, but only for a very short period of time. And training the cows on the virtual fence is a key step to cows learning and responding properly to the stimulus. Overall, we say virtual fence is a very valuable tool for ranchers, but still faces some logistic challenges like a lot of new technology will. So moving on to the second half of my study, the influence of virtual fencing on beef cattle production and wildlife conservation. So our study location was the Goodmanson Sandhills Research Laboratory, the same place where our virtual fence study took place. And a little bit of information behind Goodmanson, it's about 1,200 acres of sub-irrigated meadows and wetlands and 11,600 acres of upland sandhill range. There's approximately 500 to 600 head of cattle occupying the ranch year-round, and the key role of the ranch is to develop plant and animal production systems that are both economically and environmentally sustainable. And it also hosts the Nebraska Ranch Practicum educational program every single year. And if you haven't heard of that, I highly encourage everyone to look into it. It's a very good program. So the focus for the wildlife portion of my study was how can virtual fence aid in habitat conservation? So now we know that the virtual fence doesn't stress out the cows and that it's safe to implement into these ag operations. So how can we then use it to also positively benefit the wildlife there? So our study goal was to examine how different topographical areas can influence wildlife presence in a sandhills grassland landscape. To be able to properly manage for wildlife, you have to know what kind of wildlife are out there and where they are. So that's where the foundation for this study came from. So our study design, we had 30 game cameras deployed across the Goodmanson Sandhills Ranch. The cameras were split between 3 different topographical areas with 10 cameras in each area. Those areas were the sub-irrigated meadows, the dry valleys, and the dune tops. Cameras were deployed from June 6th to October 10th, 2023, and the images were classified by undergraduate research assistants. Now, it's important to note that obviously this is an active cattle ranch all year round, so we had to do something to combat our very curious cattle. And to do that, we created these cattle exclusion cages around our virtual fence cameras, our game cameras. And so these systems were put in place to keep the cows from rubbing on the cameras and even curious wildlife from coming up and altering the data collecting process by moving the cameras, knocking them down, things of that nature. And they worked relatively well. I was very happy with how they worked. So just diving in a little bit more on the different topographical areas, our sub-irrigated meadows, we classified those as the wet valleys in between the sand dunes where groundwater is very close to the surface, or locations directly adjacent to natural forming bodies of water, whether that be natural sandhill streams or pasture ponds. For dry valleys, grasslands occurring in between sand dunes, not near natural forming bodies of water, and dune tops were the highest elevation on the landscape, and it's just the grasslands that occur in those areas. So this is a map of our trail camera distribution. The blue dots are our dune tops, the black are the dry valleys, and the yellow are sub-irrigated meadows. I do want to point out this is not the best outline of the ranch. I got this off of the mapping technology that I use to put out my game cameras. And so this blue far north dot, it is on GSL property. The map just doesn't extend that far. But yes, as you can see, they were spread out very widely throughout the whole ranch. So just some very basic observations of what we've seen so far. These are preliminary. We're still in the middle of our data analysis process. So our total number of animals observed in each topographical area by season. So when we say season here, we split it up into a summer and fall season. And the summer season went from June 6th to around July 20th. And then our fall season started on July 20th and went to October 10th. Now, I know what a lot of people are thinking, Kaitlyn, the end of July is not fall. Yes, it's not, but because the fall is when we took those out, that's just how we classified them to keep out any confusion. So as you can see, we were really surprised that we didn't see a lot more animals in the dry valleys than what we did. Dune tops was also pretty shocking. I mean, we weren't surprised we saw a lot more animals up there in the summer than we did in the fall, but we didn't expect to see as many in the dune top as what we did. Sub-irrigated meadows, we expected those to be high. Those are the main sources of water on the ranch, so they're very attractive to a lot of species, especially during those hot summer months. Going back to dune tops really quickly, we think the reason why we saw a substantial higher number of animals during those summer months compared to those fall months is because of the fact of the vegetation changes. So a lot of times that's where your warm season grasses occur more at on a lot of those dune tops. And during the summer months and those months of early July, that's when they're at their peak. They have their highest forage value. And so a lot of those browsers and grazers like deer and pronghorn and things like that, that's like the best time for them to be up there getting those grasses. And while you move into maybe those fall months or those late summer months, a lot of those plants seed out and lose their nutritional value, which is what we think happens and what pushes more animals maybe down into those sub-irrigated meadows and things like that and out of those dune tops. So the number of different wildlife groups in each topographical area by season. Again, we saw about a difference in about 2 different groups for our dune tops. The group stayed the exact same for our sub-irrigated meadows, so we found that to be very interesting. And we saw a difference between 9 different wildlife groups occurring during the summer in dry valleys and 7 in the fall. And when I say wildlife groups, I mean it in the fact that we combined, so like white-tailed deer and mule deer were just combined into deer, and birds of prey and songbirds were just combined into birds. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, I know there's more animals than just 12 different kinds out there in the sandhills. Yes, there is. We just did a lot of grouping for the sake of simplicity here in this figure. So this is another really fun image I like to show. This is specific species found in each of the topographical areas. So these were the 12 species observed most often on our game cameras, and the areas that they were found in and the areas that they weren't found in. And so I thought it was pretty interesting as you go through. Animals like your mule deer and your pronghorns were seen in all of the different areas versus animals like your badger and your jackrabbit, where they were only seen in one of the areas. Badgers were only seen in those sub-irrigated meadows, and jackrabbits were only seen out in those dry valleys. And so I think it's really interesting to look at the species level and think about what factors and the environments they might need to thrive. And so then looking at the three different topographical areas and their different natural features and seeing what they can provide for each of these different species and like their habitats as a whole. And then again, thinking into how we can eventually use virtual fencing to maybe potentially manage these different areas to help these different wildlife. So this is one of my favorite parts, some cool pictures we captured. So this is a very pretty picture of a hawk. And then we have a young pronghorn. We have a deer. And this is probably everyone's favorite picture of the summer. And we were very excited to get a bobcat on camera. That is not something that we were expecting to do. But we just have this bobcat just walking down the bank of this little pasture pond. And then we just have a white-tailed deer standing up here on the hill, like seeming perfectly fine with everything. And that was just very surprising to see the deer that close to the bobcat and like basically no interaction whatsoever. So the future of the project, we want to turn our results into extension material and really reach a lot of those ranchers and agriculturalists in the sandhills and help them explore ways to benefit their operations, whether it's using virtual fencing or whether it's using other types of innovative technologies or management plans to actively manage their ranches for both cattle and natural resources. It's a place that really hits home for me as I grew up with an agricultural background. And so just finding ways to help ranchers benefit their operations and natural resources at the same time is a big passion of mine. So finally, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to the USDA Agricultural Research Services grant for being able to fund my project. And thank you to my advisors, Mitch Stevenson and Andy Little. Could not have done this project without you. And then all of my other collaborators and the crew that made this possible. Feel free to contact me with any questions, and thank you for listening.